remembering and commemorating the Titanic disaster on its 111th anniversary. A short documentary where we'll examine the story of the ship and the disaster and see some of the main faces, and then at the end we'll hear some of the accounts, the words of the survivors themselves. Hope you will find this informative. And this is Titanic as she stands at the bottom of the ocean now. This image was taken by one of the deep diving submarine pods when they last visited. She'll break up eventually, but this is pretty much what Titanic looked like not too many years ago. But on to some of the main faces that featured in the real disaster of the Titanic. Now, some of these people feature in the Titanic film, the one with Leonardo DiCaprio and others. Now, nearly everyone in the world has probably seen that film at least once, and if you haven't, maybe give it a watch, because it will give you a pretty good gist of the story. They did dramatise bits and pieces, but there we are. But now on to the real faces. This is Captain Edward Smith of the Titanic. Many hold the disaster part responsible to this man's decision. Captain Smith, Titanic was due to be his last voyage, not just because he died, of course, but he was due to retire. So Titanic was his last voyage, and he wanted to go out with a bang. So Captain Smith here ordered all engines fired, full speed ahead. So Titanic would arrive in America earlier than had been predicted, and had it gone on and happened, that would have been a big thing, and a big thing to end his career with. Unfortunately, it didn't end that way. In the film, Captain Smith is shown as going down with the ship with his hands on the ship's wheel, and there are many accounts that say that's what happened. He headed into the bridge and was last seen with his hands on the wheel and went down with the ship that way. This man was certainly not so well looked upon afterwards, and this is Joseph Bruce Ismay, Chairman and Managing Director of the White Star Line. He survived the disaster and made damn sure he did survive the disaster. There are several stories around it. Some say that he disguised himself as a woman and got onto a boat. I mean, could have been an Italian woman with a moustache like that, but we don't know. Another story is that he bribed his way onto a boat, and as is shown in the film, that story, that he picked up a random child and got onto a boat that way. We don't know, but we know that he survived, and for the rest of his life he was vilified and hated. I mean, he was spat at, slapped, handed white feathers, and called a coward for the rest of his days for having saved himself so voraciously, as the newspapers said. Lieutenant William McMaster Murdoch, and he was the officer in charge on the bridge when Titanic collided with the iceberg. These names are all researchable on the internet. There's so much information on them, I couldn't include it all in a relatively short documentary, so if you wish to know more about them, read them up, it's interesting. One of the more famous and well-known survivors is Commander Charles Lightoller, a very interesting man in his own right. Went on to have a prestigious naval career after Titanic as well, so have a read up on him if you like. One of the ones I found more interesting because he's an ordinary working class bloke, and you can see that by this picture. This is Frederick Fleet, sailor and lookout, and he was the first to spot the iceberg. If you've watched the film and you see the young chap that shouts "iceberg" right ahead, that's him. They would have spotted the iceberg sooner had they had their binoculars, but unfortunately their binoculars were locked away in a cupboard and the key was safely on land, so they did not have their binoculars that night. The second man, Reginald Lee, who was also up in the crow's nest like the man we've just seen, and he was stationed up there when the ship struck the iceberg, and he was the man that rang the warning down to the bridge that there was an iceberg right ahead, or that they'd struck on ice. No, it was an iceberg right ahead for the ship to turn, and they did try to turn the ship as quickly and as fast as possible. And some say now, people that reconstruct disasters and things like that, some say that had they not turned the ship and just hit the iceberg straight on, that she may have survived. The iceberg may have been broken in half and the ship would have sustained damage, but quite probably not as much as it did. But that's conjecture and we don't know that, so... Thomas Andrews, and this is the man who actually designed Titanic, and he went down with the ship. The story is that he was last seen getting himself a brandy and quietly heading off somewhere. So, another very brave chap. John Jacob Astor IV, another brave man, one of America and the world's richest men at the time, and he chose to go down with a ship like a lot of men. If he'd wanted to, he may have been able to buy his way off being so rich, but he didn't. He went down with a ship and chose to do that. Saw his wife safely onto a boat. She survived, and John here did not. Isidor and Isa Strauss, a classic but very tragic love story. Isidor was the co-owner of Macy's department store, and here's himself and his wife, Isidor and Ida Strauss. And Ida was offered and given, if she wanted it, a place on a lifeboat, and she point blank refused and said that we'd been together all these years and that's how it will stay. And these two chose to go down together. In the film they're shown as laying on their bed, arm in arm, holding hands, and that's in the film how they went down. Whether that happened or not we don't know, but they were last seen together heading towards their cabin with Isidor's arm around Ida. So it's a very beautiful, sad and tragic story. And the 7 men of the band shown here, such brave men. They did play on as the Titanic was sinking. There are different stories and different accounts as to what songs or tunes they played, and as to what song they was playing last, when they was last heard. Some say it was Nearer My God to Me, which is the song I chose to open this documentary with, which was played by myself on the piano, somewhat amateurly, I know, but I can't get copyrighted for it that way. But yeah, I mean, such brave men. They played on. When they first started playing, they kept the music cheerful and lively to try and raise people's spirits, and they played right on until they could play no more. But how bloody brave. And now you're going to actually hear the real life accounts and words and experiences of Titanic survivors. This is a group of them that were interviewed in 1957. So these are just 2 of the survivors shown in 1912 in this original picture. But now on to the remembrances of survivors, much later on and recorded in 1957. So off we go.
Take up the story from survivors of the Titanic themselves. First of all, an American passenger, Miss Edith Russell, traveling first class. Where were you just before it happened, Miss Russell?
In the library. The steward had just called out, 11:30, lights out. So I gave him a few letters to post in the morning, told him I'd pay for the stamps, picked up a book and walked forward to my stateroom, which was on the same deck, A11. And as I got in my stateroom, I switched on the electric light, and I noticed a slight jar, followed immediately by a second one, and a third one, which was quite strong enough to make me hold on to the bedpost. The boat came to a full stop. I walked forward to my window and saw a grayish-white mass drifting by. I was very much surprised and decided to take my fur coat and go out on deck and see what it was all about. Well, when I got out on deck, I noticed the gentleman standing by the rail and several people in a large, again, this grayish mass. I said, what on earth is that? That? Oh, madam, that's a lifeboat. That's an iceberg. Iceberg? Gracious, I've always wanted to see one of those things since I was a child. Well, you're seeing it Corker now. There's 1/8 above the water and 7/8 below. And believe me, that's some iceberg. So, after that, we picked up bits of ice, played snowballs for a little while, and it was very, very cold. I asked one of the officers if there was any danger. He said no, and I went back to bed.
Simple as that. No danger as far as you were concerned.
No danger.
Now, what about Mr. Witter, second-class smoking room steward? What did you think the Titanic had hit, Mr. Witter?
Well, I didn't think she'd hit anything. I thought she'd dropped a blade from the propeller, you know.
How did you find out what in fact had happened?
Well, I went down to the working alleyway where my cabin is, number 7 glory hole. I was standing there talking to 2 or 3 fellas, and the carpenter came along, and I heard him say, the bloody mailroom's full of water. I said, what's that ship, mailroom full of water? He said, yes. I said, well, what about those bulkhead doors forward? He said, they're not holding, Jim. Of course, then I walked into my cabin, number 7 glory hole, and I opened my box. I called everybody. I said, come along, fellas, get up, she's going down. So I opened my box, took out some matches, some cigarettes, and I said, come on, fellas, get out. What the hell are you talking about? They said, get out of here. And someone threw a boot at me. I said, good night, gentlemen. Just as easy as that.
As far as they're concerned, no danger either, not at that time. Well, now, Commander Lightoller, the second officer of the Titanic, died recently, but in 1936 he broadcast his story of that night. And it left 6 compartments open to the sea. The water flowed into the first 6 compartments forward of number 4 boiler room and caused her bows to sink so much that the water flowed over the top of the aftermost watertight bulkhead, filled the next compartment, then overflowed again into the next one, and so on. Well, from that moment, as the captain very well realized, nothing could save the Titanic, and the order was given, lower the boats. Quartermaster Rowe, who's here tonight, was a very surprised man. Where were you, Quartermaster?
I went on watch on the poop at 8 o'clock. At 10 o'clock I read the log and passed it onto the fore bridge. At 20 minutes to 12 I was pacing up and down the deck and I felt a good jar. I thought that was peculiar. I looked along the side and I saw what I thought was a windjammer, but as it came astern I saw it was an iceberg. The engine was going full speed astern then, so I pulled the lug in. After that it got a bit quiet, except for the blowing off of steam, and heard nothing or see nothing till I saw a lifeboat being lowered on the starboard side. I reported it to the bridge. I asked them if they knew there was a boat being lowered. They said they did, and wanted to know who I was. I said I was the after quartermaster. They asked me if I knew where the distress rockets were. I said yes. They said bring them on the bridge. When Captain Smith saw me bring them up, he told me to fire one and fire one every 5 or 6 minutes. After about 2 or 3 minutes he said to me, can you Morse? I said yes, a bit. He said call that light up, tell her where the Titanic's sinking, please get all your boats ready. She never answered.
And that's your strange story, Quartermaster.
Yeah.
Just like that.
Just like that.
Now, what about a third-class passenger, Mr. Cohen? I think, Mr. Cohen, you'd had a bit of a celebration with the boys that night.
Yes, I did. We had a celebration with a glass of lemonade.
Am I supposed to believe that?
Yes, you was. So my pals do.
Did you get yourself a life belt early on in the proceedings?
No, not at the time. The reason was because we thought the Titanic was unsinkable.
When did you really believe at last that she was going down?
When the boat was listing. And then I decided to find a lifeboat. I found it very quickly, and then I went towards the lifeboats. I never had a chance to get in any one of them because the order was women and children first. So as I was 11, 19, I was out of it. So I decided to find my own salvation. I went across to the Devitt, climbed across the Devitt, which was a dangerous thing at Tarney, and went down the rope about 80 feet long and went into the water, into the sea rather.
It sounds easy now, quick, doesn't it, when you tell it?
Yes, it does. But
I bet you wouldn't like to do it now.
No, well, not with this.
I don't know whether they can see you lower down. I don't think they can, but they can imagine it.
Yes.
It's not as bad as they may think.
Yes.
Now, was that lifeboat that picked you up eventually, was it full?
No, it was about 25 people in it. The reason it was fairly empty as it was, because the people on a boat never realised that the boat would sink, and not many people took the opportunity of going into the lifeboats.
A greater risk leaving the ship than staying aboard.
That's right, yes.
Let's ask Miss Russell to take up her story again, and let's jump ahead in time. The last we heard from you, Miss Russell, you were going to bed. You decided to go to bed. Now, let's go forward to the time when you were on deck and you asked Wareham, your steward, to go and find your little pig, your mascot. Would you take up from there?
I was on A deck in the lounge when Wareham came along, and I said to him, here Wareham are my trunk keys. Would you mind taking care of my trunks if I don't get back in time in the morning? So he said, you better go in and kiss those trunks goodbye. I said, you don't think there's any danger, do you? If there is, why, you better go back and get my mascot. My mascot was a little pig, a music box. It had been given to me by my mother after a motor accident fatal to everybody but me in France. So he brought the little pig back. It played the matchich. After that, I was in the direct line of light with Bruce Ismay, who saw me and picked me up like a puppy and threw me down the steps. But I was wearing a sheath dress, very narrow skirt, a long fur coat, a woolen cap, some furs, evening slippers, and one thing another, thin stockings. And I went forward to the rail, looked at that very, very high rail with the lifeboat swinging way out on its davits, and I knew I never could make it, not in that skirt. So as I stood there hesitating, a sailor grabbed this little pig from under my arm and said, "Well, if you don't want to be saved, we'll save your child," and he threw the pig into the lifeboat. Well, I stood there hesitating, and as I said to a gentleman alongside, "Should I leave?" He said, "Definitely, madam." Well, I said, "Can't make it." So now, if you will just sit on my hand, this sailor and I will make a little cradle of our hands. You sit down, put your hand around my neck, and we'll toss you right into the lifeboat. And they did. First thing I did then was to hunt for the little pig. I found it, the bottom of the boat with its legs broken, but it still could play the matchich, and I played it all night long to keep the children from crying.
Thank you, Miss Russell. Well, meantime, the entire crew and all the officers of the Titanic were working frantically. And in the wireless room, the chief radio officer, Jack Phillips, was trying to contact nearby ships. The nearest was the Californian, but her solitary operator had gone to bed. The officer of the watch reported the Titanic's rockets and the disappearance of her lights to the captain, but no action was taken. Meantime, Phillips from the Titanic was sending out the old CQD call, the standard distress signal of those times. But then he changed to SOS, the first time it had ever been used at sea. And one of the ships to pick that up was the Carpathia, the captain, Captain Rostron. Now, Harold Cottam, there he is, was the operator of the Carpathia, and he received the signal. And here he is, sending his answer now. Now, this equipment you're using now, Mr. Cottam, I understand is the same as in the Titanic, except for the buzzer that Marconi Marine supplied for the Titanic.
Yes,
is that not right?
Yes.
We've got the coil there,
Yes.
the tuning here,
Yes.
and the receiving.
Yes.
And there was the transmission, was it not?
Yes.
With the spark flying from
Yes.
the points when you press the buzzer.
Yes.
And here the charging and distributing apparatus.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Cottam, the Titanic called you in distress. What was your reaction?
Well, she didn't call me. I called her.
Uh-huh.
About 1 o'clock in the morning, after I'd taken the press, or listened to the press, I took a batch of message for her, and with the intention of redirecting them on to her, I called her up. And the only reply I got that she'd struck ice. And I said, "Was it serious?" And she said, "Yes, this is a CQD, old man. Here's the position, report it, and get here as soon as you can." So I took the position and on a scrap of paper and rushed up to the bridge with it. When I got on the bridge, I contacted the officer of the watch, and the information didn't seem as though it had sunk as fast as I thought it ought to, so I rushed down the ladder and knocked on the captain's cabin, and as I saw a light, I rushed in. And he said, "Who the hell?" or words to that effect. And so I said, "Well, the Titanic struck ice, sir, and she's in distress. I've got the position here." So he said, "Well, give it me," and he put a dressing gown on and went. So he said, "Will you confirm this? Go aft and confirm it if you can."
Which you did.
Yes, which I did.
And when you came back, what did he do?
When I came back, he said, "Well, you'd better go back and tell her that we're going to double bank all the watches on deck and below, and tell him we are
On our way?
on our way."
As
and-
fast as you could go.
Yes, as fast as you could go.
Fine, thank you, Mr. Cottam.
Yes.
Well, the Carpathia was on its way, and back on the Titanic, the last lifeboat got away round about 1:20 in the morning, and it had over 60 people on board. From the boat, they watched the ship with husbands, relations, and friends still aboard, still unable to believe that she was doomed. Commander Lightoller was less than 100 yards away on the top of an upturned boat.
As I watched, I could see her bow getting deeper and deeper in the water, with the foremast sticking up above the surface, whilst her stern lifted higher and higher, till it was right out of the water. When she got to an angle of about 60 degrees, there was a sullen sort of rumbling roar, as her massive boilers all left their beds and went crashing down through the bulk's heads and everything that stood in their way. Up to that moment, she had stood out as clear with her rows of electric lights all burning. When the boilers broke away, she was, of course, plunged into absolute darkness, though her huge black outline was still perfectly distinct up against the stars and sky. Slowly she reared up on end, till at last she was absolutely perpendicular. Then, quite quietly, but quicker and quicker, she seemed just to slide away under the surface and disappear.
In the lifeboats, the survivors braced themselves for the rigors of a long night. And one of those survivors, a greaser, Mr. Walter Hurst, got there in a very strange way. What's your story, Mr. Hurst?
Well, I saw the forey part of the boat deck dip underwater, so I jumped overboard. Swimming away from the ship, turned around to look at her, but down came the funnel and smashed into the water right in front of my face. I got a gush of wind and dirt through that nearly blinded me, and I felt the cap go off my head and one slipper off my foot. But it didn't take my attention off of this boat, and I see the collapsible boat washed straight over off the deck, within a few yards of me. But I managed to get onto it, and I was followed quickly by the second officer and a few others. But anyhow, she soon got filled up. There was an old man stood next to me. He was complaining all the night long about his head was so cold. Well, I took particular note of that because mine was pretty cold too. But a friend of mine, a shipmate named Lindsay, gave me a drink from a bottle. I thought I was on a good thing. I think it was whiskey or brandy. Instead of that, it was essence of peppermint. Nearly choked me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hurst.
I hope you found this interesting or informative, if of course sad. Thanks very much for watching. If you did find it interesting, please hit the like and share button. Thanks very much for watching.